Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Sixth Form Assembly. If you've had a reason to visit Google today, you will have seen a rather nice doodle appearing on the homepage, which I will describe to you. There's a purple horse, a seated man with slightly uncomfortable looking legs. He's sitting rather too close to a campfire, which is being kind of inflamed or boosted by a fire-breathing dragon. Quite a friendly-looking fire-breathing dragon. The seated figure is toasting some bread on the end of his sword. I sometimes wonder how big the research and development team are for these doodles at Google. Of course, actually, it's a competition, isn't it? Anyway, besides the point. Today's doodle, of course, is commemorating the fact that today is St. George's Day, the 23rd of April. Now, some of you will make an immediate link with the dragon in the doodle, having heard the name St. George. Others will now notice that he's got a red cross on his chest, that red cross of St. George, and make the link to the flag of England, because, yes, St. George is the patron saint of England, and today is the 1717th anniversary of his death. Now that's quite a long time to be remembered and celebrated, and George is one of the most celebrated of all saints. He's the patron saint of many countries, not just England. You may know this, including Greece and Ethiopia, Palestine, Germany. In Catalonia, for example, St. George's Day is a big deal and is celebrated a bit like Valentine's Day is celebrated, and the men will traditionally give women a red rose on St. George's Day, and the women give men a book, which I can't help but think is slightly better end of the deal, but anyway. So St. George's Day used to be a national holiday in England, and it was a fairly big deal here too, but that fell out of fashion in the 18th century, and now, beyond that vague association with dragons and the cross of St. George, he's not so well remembered these days. So I thought maybe we'd remind ourselves of who he was, and this would seem to be an appropriate day to do it. So he's born in what's now Turkey, and spends most of his life as a soldier, as part of the Roman army that had that empire that at the time in 303 AD, or before 303 when he died, that at the time was huge and encompassed much of the land surrounding the Mediterranean, much of Europe, Middle East, North Africa, those sorts of places. It's thought that George was part of what was known as the Praetorian Guard, which was a kind of elite, I like to think of them being as a sort of elite crack force of guard soldiers that were assigned to the emperor himself, who was a man called Diocletian at that point, who was the man in charge of this vast Roman Empire, of course. Now, the legends existing about George are varied depending on which version, of course, you read. The Greek version, it goes like this: the young George, born to Christian parents, joins the Roman army, whereupon he's persecuted because of his Christian faith, which he refuses to give up. Now, those of you who remember your GCSE English literature will remember Shylock in the courtroom scene at the end. One of his punishments for his unwillingness to show mercy, or his determination to stick to his bond, one of his punishments is that he has to renounce his faith, and most of you were united in your kind of condemnation of that punishment as being a terrible, terrible punishment. Well, anyway, that was a punishment that was meted out to George, and he refused to give up his faith, and he was executed. In the Greek version, he's executed by having his head cut off. According to the story, the Empress Alexandra witnessed this execution and the suffering concerned, and his bravery around that suffering, and she was so moved by it that she converted to Christianity and was martyred as well. That's the Greek version. In the Latin version, unfortunately, George's death isn't quite as surgically neat. His martyrdom was stretched out with 20 terrible tortures over the course of 7 years, during which, so the story goes, some 40,000 pagans were converted. And I include the word pagans because I know that you're quite fond of that word. 40,000 pagans, including the Empress. And apparently, when George died, in the Latin version of the story, the emperor was carried away in a whirlwind of fire, which was presumably serving him right. Like many stories like this, there seems to be lots of solid historical evidence that George the man existed, but the facts of his life and death are the stuff of legend and vary accordingly. You'll have noticed, for example, a complete lack of dragons, a disappointing lack of dragons in the story so far. That bit seems to have been added much later, maybe almost 1,000 years later, and tells the story of a Libyan province, so part of present-day Libya, that was being terrorised by a ravenous dragon. I'm sure you're familiar with the type of story, even if not this particular story. And when you think dragon, I want you to think of kind of Lord of the Rings dragon for this bit, rather than the sort of dragon that you might learn to tame. So the townsfolk, in the best traditions of this type of story, could only keep this beast from destroying them all by offering the beast sacrifice. And it starts off with them, of course, giving bits of their harvest, and the dragon gets a bit bored of that, wants to spice up his diet with the children of the townsfolk, and they do, sadly, hand over their children. They seem fairly ready to pay that price until the tariff reaches the king's own daughter, and then it was a case of, oh, hang on a minute, slow down. And then enter the brave St. George. I like to imagine him kind of riding into town like some kind of Dark Ages cowboy gunslinger. So he steps up and, of course, offers to and does slay the dragon with his lance. The king is so grateful that he gave George vast treasures as a reward, which George then distributes to the poor. The people were so amazed that they all became Christian and were baptised. You'll have noticed a theme here. You don't get made a saint for nothing. St. George then is a central figure in the pantheon of saints, and his image features widely in churches, paintings, stained glass windows, statues and the like. Often he's represented in the act of defeating the dragon, which, it has to be said, is often in these representations a bit of a disappointment, more of a sort of small squirmy snake lizard thing with wings, such that in some of the paintings you kind of can feel slightly sorry for it, kebabbed as it is on the end of George's lance, as he sits there armoured to the teeth on this huge horse. Or you might find yourself wondering whether the townspeople had actually seen the dragon at the point that they were handing over their children to appease it. Perhaps if they'd realised what a modest dragon it was, they might have at least have tried to kind of gang up on him and given it a go themselves. But that's not the point. It's not the point of the story, of course, or the point of any of these types of stories. What's important in these types of stories is the powerful imagery. It's the good versus evil. It's the triumph of light over darkness. It's a story that has been retold so many times, and in your cultural consciousness you'll have the Harry Potter stories, you'll have the Lord of the Rings stories, you'll have Star Wars stories, which is that same narrative told again and again. It's a narrative and an image that's central to Christianity too, as it is to many other faiths. George is specifically remembered in Islam too. In some texts he's a prophet, in others he's a rich merchant who opposed a statue of Apollo that was going to be put up in the city of Mosul in present-day Iraq, and the king of Mosul was going to put up this statue of Apollo. And George said, the merchant George said, no, he opposed the setting up of the statue, saying that such idols were sort of possessed by Satan. Hearing this, so the story goes, God destroys the entire city in a rain of fire, and George was again martyred. So it's interesting that George crops up throughout the Middle East as a saint and in places a prophet. He's like a kind of composite personality, incorporating elements of the Bible, elements of Quranic teaching, and all sorts of other mythical heroes, all in one sort of symbolic figure, which maybe explains part of his international appeal. But, I hear you ask, what's all this got to do with him being the patron saint of England? What's it got to do with England? We don't have any dragons. George never came anywhere near England. So what's the connection? Why did we used to have a national holiday to him? Why is his name on all our calendars for April 23rd? And why is he on our Google search page today, not to mention decorating all those churches? Well, perhaps it's something to do with the power of that story, of his story, and the power of those stories to create ideas. St. George bravely faces those tortures and that dragon and has come to represent the qualities of courage in the face of adversity or danger. He's quite an important figurehead in the British Army for that reason, as I'm sure he is in many armies. He represents those qualities of bravery and heroism, which are values towards this country is certainly not alone in looking towards for inspiration and comfort. But in his role as patron saint of England, of course, he crops up in English literature again and again as a symbol of those values of courage and heroism in moments of crisis. One of the most famous moments is in one of Shakespeare's great history plays, Henry V. You might know it, where the English are all lined up against the French at the Battle of Agincourt. They're facing off at the Battle of Agincourt, and they have this young King Harry. And the speech goes, Harry is encouraging his army to attack, and he introduces the speech with those famous words, "Once more into the breach, dear friends," which is a phrase which has kind of become absorbed into an idea of character. It's no surprise that speech finishes with the king urging his men with the words, "Cry God for Harry and St. George." So there's George again popping up. He's a figure that was often called upon in times of war and other crises as a symbol of national inspiration and strength. And even today, where notions of nationhood and national identity are perhaps less useful or defining than they were in less globally connected days, even today, we are still looking to those values that George represents of strength and courage, perhaps especially at the moment, with what this nation and many nations are facing. So on that note, it is St. George's Day. Happy St. George's Day. And I'd like to wish you and your family a bit of that strength and courage for as long as necessary as we get through this national crisis. So take care. I hope to see you all soon, and until next week, all the best.